The bell above the print shop door rang at 7:30 on a gray October morning, and Lucinda Frail, who had been awake since 4 copying the second violin part of a borrowed quartet, did not look up at once, because the men who came so early were rarely men who paid. Then the cold came in with the visitor, and she felt it cross the room before she saw who carried it. A tall man stood in the doorway with rain still bright on the shoulders of a navy coat, and he did not shake it off, and he did not speak. He held a folded paper in one gloved hand, and his eyes found her at the copying desk as though he had known exactly where she would be sitting. She rose because one rose for a gentleman, and the ink on her fingers was wet, and her plain gray gown had a frayed cuff she had meant for a month to mend. He crossed to the counter and set the paper down between them and said, his voice low, that he required a fair copy of it before noon and that he would wait. She turned it toward herself. It was not music. It was a marriage license, and the names upon it were his own and hers, and the date upon it was that very day. She had been his wife for 11 hours. She had not yet told a soul. By the time the church clocks of Lindo struck 8 the following morning, she would not be his wife at all, and the woman who had unmade it would be sitting at the head of his table, eating toast, as though nothing in the world had moved. To understand how a quiet woman of 24 came to be married before dawn and severed before breakfast, one must go back some months to the spring she first heard the name of Wexlow spoken without fear. Lucinda had not always lived above a print shop. Her father had been the vicar of a small living 3 valleys distant, a gentle scholar who taught her Latin and the figured bass before he taught her caution, and who died of a low fever when she was 19 and left her nothing but his books and a name that opened no doors. The living went to a stranger. The furniture went to the creditors. She went, with 2 trunks and a square of folded music in her father's hand, to the town of Lindo, where a printer named Gostick needed a copyist who could read a difficult score and did not mind the smell of ink, and who would work for less than a man because the world had decided she had nowhere else to be. The town had decided other things about her, too. To Lindo, she was the vicar's girl who had come down in the world, neither servant nor lady, a woman who walked to church alone and curtsied correctly, and was therefore suspected of pride. Mrs. Pemberton, who kept the linen draper's 2 doors along and considered herself the conscience of the High Street, put it plainly to a customer one wet afternoon, in a voice pitched to carry through the thin wall. She is a copyist with the manners of a duchess and the prospects of a charwoman, Mrs. Pemberton said, and one does not know which to pity. Lucinda heard it through the lath and went on ruling her staves, and did not let the pen waver, because a wavering line had to be scraped out and done again, and she could not afford the time. What Lindo did not know was that the Duke of Wexlow had heard her play. It had happened by accident, in the way that the largest things often arrive disguised as the smallest. The great estate of Ravelston lay 4 miles north of the town, and its chapel organ had fallen silent, that lent because the old instrument wheezed and stuck and no one local could be found to set its voicing right. Gostick, who supplied the estate with printed sermons and account books, had recommended his copyist, who knew the inside of an organ because her father had taught her to tune their own. So Lucinda had gone up to Ravelston on a hired pony in March, climbed into the dusty loft above the chapel with a leather roll of small tools, and spent 3 days among the pipes while the rain ran down the long windows. On the 3rd afternoon, the voicing done, she had played. She had not meant to be heard. She thought the chapel empty. She played a slow air her father had loved, and then, because the instrument answered her now, and it had been a long while since anything had, she played on, and she did not know that a man had come in out of the wet and stopped in the shadow of the screen, and stood without moving until the last chord had died into the stone. He had said, only that he had not heard the chapel sound like that in 7 years. He had said it from the shadow, so that she startled and stood and could not at first see his face. Then he stepped into the gray light, and she saw that his jaw was set like carved stone, and his eyes were the color of smoke over water, and that he was not cold so much as held a man with a hand kept always on his own reins. He was the Duke. She curtsied too late and too low. He looked at her ink-stained fingers, and her father's tools laid out on a cloth, and something in his face changed and was disciplined back into stillness before she could name it. That was the beginning, though neither of them called it anything. For a long time, there is a thing the world forgets, which is that attention can be entirely silent and still be the loudest fact in a room. The Duke did not court her. A duke does not court a copyist. The words do not even fit together in the mouths of the people who arrange such things. What he did was smaller and harder to deny. He found reasons for the chapel organ to require attention through the spring and into the summer. He found that the estate's library held music that wanted copying. Real music, paid at a fair rate. More than Gostick had ever sent her way. He took to walking in the long gallery when she crossed it, and he asked her once, gravely, whether the second movement of a certain sonata was meant to be taken so slowly. And she answered honestly that it was meant to be taken slowly enough to hurt. And he was quiet for the length of 3 breaths and then said that he had always thought so, and had never had anyone to say it to. She told herself it was the music. She was a sensible woman, and she told herself a great many sensible things that summer, and her heart did not believe a single one of them, and she went on telling them anyway because the alternative was unbearable. He was a duke. She was the vicar's girl with the frayed cuff. The distance between them was not a distance that affection could cross. It was a law written into the arrangement of the whole world, and she had been raised to respect laws, even when they cost her. The Duke had a wound she did not yet understand, and it lived in the 7 years he had named in the chapel. His younger brother had been named Robert, and Robert had loved a woman the family judged beneath him, the daughter of a naval surgeon with no fortune and a quick laugh, and Robert had married her against his mother's will. The Dowager Duchess had not raged. That was not her instrument. She had simply closed the door, quietly and completely, the way one closes a door against a draft, and Robert and his wife had gone away to a damp lodging in a northern town, and lived 3 years on very little. And then Robert had taken a fever, and his mother had not gone to him. And he had died estranged, with his wife's hand in his, and his brother arriving half a day too late. Hadrian had stood at that graveside in his navy coat, in a thin northern rain, and understood, fully and for the first time, what his family's idea of order was willing to cost. He had not forgiven it. He had also not defied it, because he had not yet found the thing worth the defiance. He found it in a chapel loft, in a woman who tuned an organ with her father's tools, and played an air as though grief were a country she had a passport to. By September, it could no longer be called the music. They both knew it and neither said it, and the not saying became its own dense weather between them. He learned that she sang the alto line under her breath when she thought herself alone. She learned that he could not bear to be thanked, that praise made him turn his face away as though it were a draught, and that this was grief and not pride, though it would have been easy to mistake. One afternoon in the gallery, his glove brushed hers as he handed her a folio, and neither of them moved their hand for the length of a held breath, and then both of them moved at once and looked away, and the folio nearly fell, and that near falling was the most honest thing that had passed between them in 6 months. The trouble came from the south, and it came in a traveling carriage with a crest on the door. The Dowager Duchess of Wexlow arrived at Ravelston in the last week of September, intending to settle the question of her son's marriage as one settles a debt before quarter day. She was not a cruel woman in the way the word is usually meant. She was something more durable than cruel. She was certain. She had spent 60 years inside an order that had never once failed to reward her for protecting it, and she protected it now the way a good steward protects a hedge, without malice and without mercy, because the hedge was the boundary, and the boundary was the world. She had a candidate. Miss Caroline Vosbury possessed £40,000, a faultless complexion, and a mother who agreed with the Dowager about everything, and the match would join 2 estates whose fields had stared at each other across a river for 3 generations. The Dowager arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday she had taken the measure of the household, and on Friday she summoned the copyist to the small drawing-room, ostensibly to discuss the binding of the chapel music, and there she delivered the first of 3 judgments that Lucinda would carry through the worst hours of her life. She did it gently. That was the whole of her art. She had, Lucinda admitted, had her stand on the cold side of the hearth and looked at her over a cup of chocolate for rather longer than was comfortable. And then she said, in a voice as smooth as the chocolate, that she understood the chapel sounded very well now, and that the estate was grateful. And that, of course, a young woman in Lucinda's position must be sensible above all things, for sense was the only fortune left to a girl whose father had died poor. "You are a tradesman's hire, my dear," the dowager said, setting down her cup without a sound. "A useful one. Do not mistake usefulness for belonging. The two are very often confused by girls who play well." Then she rang for the music to be brought, and discussed the binding for a quarter of an hour as though nothing else had been said. And Lucinda copied out the binder's instructions in a steady hand and walked the 4 miles back to Lindo in the dusk and did not weep until she had shut her own door. A tradesman's hire. The phrase sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. She resolved, walking, to end it. There was nothing to end, she told herself. No understanding, no promise. Nothing the world would even recognize as a thing, and that was precisely why she could end it cleanly. By simply not going back. She would send word that the chapel was in good order and her services no longer required, and she would copy other men's music until she was old, and the Duke would marry his heiress and join his fields to her fields, and the whole arrangement of the world would close over the place where she had stood like water over a dropped stone. She had survived her father's death. She would survive this smaller thing. She did not reckon on the Duke riding into Lindo himself. He came on the second day when her note had reached him, and he did not send a servant, and he did not stand on ceremony. He came into the print shop with the rein on his shoulders, and Gostick, scenting something beyond his understanding, found urgent business in the back room. The Duke stood at the counter where she would later stand reading her own married name, and he set down her note, which he had read, and he said her name, not Miss Frail. He said Lucinda plainly, the first time her given name had ever been in his mouth, and the sound of it went through her like the low note of the organ went through the stone. He told her then in short level sentences what he had not let himself say in 6 months. He told her that his mother had spoken to her, that he knew the shape of what had been said because he had heard it said before to another woman in another room, and that the last time he had honored that voice instead of his own, a man he loved, had died in a damp lodging, with no one of his blood beside him but a wife. He said he would not do it again. He said he was not asking her to be his mistress, and not asking her to wait and not offering her a future arranged around the convenience of his family. He said he was asking her to marry him, and that he knew exactly what it would cost them both, and that he had spent 7 years learning that the cost of the other thing was higher. She said the only honest thing she had. She said that his mother would never permit it. He said that was true, and that he did not intend to ask her. And so they did the thing that desperate, honorable people in that age could still do. The thing the law left as a narrow door for those whom custom barred from the wide one. They would marry quietly, by license rather than by banns, so that the parish would not have 3 Sundays to carry the news to Ravelston, and they would marry before his mother could move to prevent it, and once it was done, it would be done, for a marriage solemnized was a fact of stone. He had a friend at the law, a Mr. Lindo, who would procure the license. There was a curate at a chapel of ease beyond the town, a poor unbeneficed man named Brockholt, who owed the Duke nothing, and feared the dowager not at all, who would read the words at an hour when no one watched. What Lucinda did not know, because no one yet did, was that the Dowager Duchess had not spent her Friday merely drinking chocolate. She had set a footman to watch, and she had written that same evening to her own man of law in the cathedral town, a careful note asking what hypothetically might be done about a marriage made in haste by a young man not yet fully master of his estate. She was all ready while they planned their door, oiling the lock against them. They were married at 4 o'clock in the morning in the chapel of ease, by candle and by Mr. Day, Brockholt's reading with the sexton and the sexton's wife, as witnesses and no one else in the cold little nave. Lucinda wore the same gray gown because she had no other, and the Duke had taken her bare hand in his own bare hand, the first time, and his hand was not steady, which she had not expected, and never forgot. Brockholt read the words plainly and joined them, and the sexton's wife wept a little from the simple beauty of it, and outside an owl crossed the churchyard, and it was done. Lucinda Frail, who had been a tradesman's hire, was the Duchess of Wexlow, and no one in the sleeping county knew it but 7 people, and the owl. He had ridden back to Ravelston before light, because they had agreed he must be seen to rise in his own house as on any morning, and the news must be presented to his mother by him in daylight as an accomplished and unalterable fact with the license in his hand. He had given Lucinda the license to keep safe, and then, near dawn, sent his own man back to fetch it copied fair, for reasons of the law. He barely understood himself, which is why a marriage license, and not a quartet, lay on the print shop counter at 7:30, and why she stood reading her own married name in the grey light, with 11 hours of marriage behind her, and did not yet know the ground had already opened. It had opened in the cathedral town at 6 that morning. The dowager's man of law, roused early by a rider, had found exactly the flaw she had hoped for, and feared he would not. The license, procured in such haste by Mr. Dim. Lindo had named the wrong parish for the bride's residence, an honest slip. Lindo having written Lindo Town, where the bride in strict law still belonged to the distant parish of her father's old living, whose registers had never been amended. And Mr. Dawston Brockholt, the poor unbeneficed curate, held his reader's license for one chapel only, and had no faculty to solemnize a marriage by special arrangement in a parish not his own without the proper authority, which in the haste of the night no one had thought to confirm. On those 2 threads, fine as the hairs of a copying pen, the whole stone marriage hung. By the canons of the church, a union so irregularly made was not merely frowned upon, it was voidable. It could be declared null as though it had never been, by the proper ecclesiastical authority on the petition of an interested party. And there was no party in England more interested, or better placed to be heard quickly, than the Dowager Duchess of Wexlow. She had moved before the Duke had finished his breakfast, while Lucinda walked back from the print shop with the fair copy folded against her heart. A fast rider was already carrying the Dowager's petition, with her man of law's opinion attached, to a surrogate of the diocese who had dined at her late husband's table many times, and owed the family more courtesies than he could count. By the time the Duke laid the license before his mother in the long library at Ravelston and told her, in the level voice he had practiced all night, that he was married, and that nothing could be done, she had simply looked at him and waited, and let the silence do its work, and then told him gently that something had already been done. She had the surrogate's preliminary inhibition in her own desk. The marriage, she said, would be heard and annulled within the week, and until then he was forbidden by the church to treat the woman as his wife. And she suggested with great kindness that he consider how much less the girl would be hurt if the matter were ended quietly now, before the county had a name to laugh at. It was the second judgment, delivered not to Lucinda this time, but about her, in the public exchange of the household, where the upper servants could hear and would carry it down. The girl is no wife, the dowager said to her son. In the library with the door open, she is a copyist who reached above her station, and the law agrees with me, and you will thank me before the year is out. The Duke did not thank her. He rode that afternoon to Lindo in a state Lucinda had never seen. His face no longer carved stone, but stone that had cracked, and he told her everything, standing in the same small parlor over the print shop, and she listened to the end without sitting down. He told her the license was flawed, that Brockholt had lacked the faculty, that his mother had a paper from the diocese already, that the church would unmake in a week what it had made in a night. He said he would fight it. He said he would go to the bishop himself, to London, to the highest court of the church if he must, and she heard underneath the words the helplessness of a man who had bet everything on a door and found it had been locked from the other side the whole time he had been opening it. And she did, then, the thing that would matter more than anything else, though it looked at the time like surrender. She did not weep, and she did not cling. She took the flawed license from the counter and folded it and put it into his hands. And she told him that he must not ruin himself for her in a quarrel he could not win on a technicality, that the world would say she had trapped a young duke, and that the saying of it would harm him for 30 years. She said it steadily, and only the white of her knuckles betrayed her. She said she would release him, and that he must let her, because the one thing she could still give him was the dignity of not being destroyed by a flaw in a clerk's hand. It was the most generous thing anyone had ever offered him, and it was. He understood with a cold clarity exactly the spirit his mother lacked and would never recognize, the willingness to lose oneself for the sake of the person one loved. He refused. She insisted. They stood there in the small, cold room, and neither would take the safety the other offered, and that more than the candlelit chapel was the true marriage, whatever the church decided. He went to the bishop and was received with sympathy and regret, and no help at all, because the surrogate's paper was technically sound, and the dowager's friends were many, and a bishop must live among them. He went to Mr. Prowl, Lindo, who was sick with the shame of his own slip and could do nothing to mend it. The week began to close. The hearing was set, and in Lindo, the news did, as the dowager had known it would, find a tongue. Mrs. Machen. Pemberton had it within 3 days, embroidered, and stood in her shop doorway, and delivered the third judgment, the one Lucinda overheard for herself returning from the well with a pitcher. The copyist played herself into a duke's marriage, and the family had to call in the church to scrub it out, Mrs. Pemberton said to a knot of listeners, in the public street, in daylight. And there is a name for women who do that, and it is not Duchess. Lucinda walked past with her pitcher, and did not break stride, and did not let one drop spill, and went up her own stairs, and set the pitcher down and sat very still in the dark for a long time. And this was the lowest hour, lower than her father's grave. Because at her father's grave she had at least been allowed to grieve a thing the world agreed was real. She believed, in that dark room, that nothing further could come. You might know better. Worth that has once been truly seen does not unsee itself, and a marriage is more than a paper. And there were things already in motion that neither the dowager nor the law had counted. The light, when it came from a direction no one had thought to watch. For the dowager had made one error, and it was the error of all people whose script has worked everywhere, which is that she had mistaken the curate Brockholt for a man too poor to matter. Mr. Brockholt was poor. He was also, having no living to lose, and no patron to fear, the one free man in the whole affair, and he had been troubled in his conscience since the night of the marriage by the irregularity. He had only half understood at the time. When the inhibition came down and he learned that his own want of faculty was being made the lever to break two souls apart, he did not bow his head. He went, on his own poor legs and his own poorer purse, to the cathedral town, and there he did the thing that careful men of law had not troubled to do, because the dowager's case did not require it, and the duke's lawyers had been looking in the wrong place. He searched the registers. What he found, he could not at first believe. The distant parish of Lucinda's father, the very parish whose unamended register the dowager's man had used to prove the bride resident in the wrong place, told a different story when read whole rather than skimmed for a flaw. Lucinda's father, the old vicar, in his last year of failing health, had performed one final piece of parish business that no one had thought to look at, because no one had reason to. He had, on the authority of his own incumbency and in proper form, certified his daughter's removal and settlement to the town of Lindo, when she went there to earn her bread, and entered it correctly in the register, and signed it and dated it 3 weeks before he died. The dowager's case rested on the claim that Lucinda still belonged in law to her father's old parish. Her father, with the last clear strokes of his pen, in an entry the family had used against her without ever reading past the heading, had himself established that she did not. She was, in strict law and by her own father's hand, a resident of Lindo. The license that named Lindo was correct. The first thread of the dowager's case was not merely answered. It had been cut years before by a dying man who had wanted only to leave his daughter's affairs in order. The second thread, Brockholt's want of faculty. He could not mend by himself, but he did not need to. He carried the register entry to the Duke's man, and the Duke's lawyers, who had been fighting on the wrong ground, suddenly understood they had been handed solid ground to stand on. For the law of such marriages turned in part on the good faith of the parties. A union made by two people who honestly and reasonably believed it regular, where the only flaw was a curate's want of authority unknown to them, stood on far firmer ground than the dowager's surrogate had let himself assume, especially once the residence question, the supposed heart of the irregularity. The whole case had been built to look heavier than it was, and the man who had married them, the man the dowager had dismissed as too poor to matter, had walked to the cathedral town on his own feet and pulled out the bottom stone. The hearing was held in the chapter house of the cathedral town on a bright, cold morning, and the county came because a duke's marriage being unmade is a spectacle, and the same people who would have crossed the street to avoid the copyist now filled the benches to watch her, broken in public. The dowager came in grey silk and sat at the front as one sits in one's own pew. Miss Vosbury came and her agreeing mother. Mrs. Pemberton came up from Lindo in her best bonnet, and Lucinda came because she had been summoned in her plain grey dress, with the cuff she had at last found an evening to mend, and she stood where she was told to stand, and folded her hands and waited to be unmade, and she had decided she would not weep where they could see it, whatever was read out. It did not go as the benches expected. The dowager's man rose and laid out the two threads, the wrong parish and the curate's want of faculty, in the confident voice of a man reading a verdict rather than arguing a case. Then the Duke's man rose, and instead of pleading for mercy, as everyone had come to enjoy, he laid the register entry of the old vicar of the distant parish upon the table, and read it aloud. The certificate of settlement in the dead father's own hand, dated 3 weeks before his death, and the dowager's man read it over twice and set it down, and did not at once find his next sentence. The first thread was gone, and then Mr. Bria. Brockholt himself, poor and plain in a coat gone green at the seams, stood up unbidden and said in a silence that he had read the words over those two people in the full belief they were free to be married, that any want of faculty was his own ignorance and not their fault, and that he would swear to their good faith before God and the bishop, both. And would they not look at what they were truly being asked to destroy? The second thread did not break so much as cease to bear weight. The surrogate, who had taken the case as a courtesy and had not expected to be watched doing it, found that the ground had moved under him and that the courtesy now cost more than it was worth. The dowager rose. This was the part no one had foreseen, that she would defend her own work in person, but she had built this, and she would not watch it taken from her in silence. She addressed the chapter herself, and her voice was still smooth, but it had in it now the faintest grain of something that was not certainty. She said that good faith did not make a marriage, that order did, that a great house was not a thing to be entered through a side door at 4 in the morning by a girl who copied music for hire, and that whatever the register said, everyone in the room knew what was fitting and what was not. It was for a moment very nearly enough, because she had named the thing the whole county actually believed, and then the Duke spoke, who had not been expected to speak at all. He did not make a speech. He rose in his navy coat, and he did not raise his voice. He said that the registers were not in question, that the law was now plain, and that the chapter could read. Then he turned, not to the surrogate, not to his mother, but to Lucinda, standing alone in her mended grey gown, and he said the only words that mattered, in front of the county that had come to watch her broken. "This is the Duchess of Wexlow. I will have no other." 8 words in the same room where the hierarchy had assembled to render its verdict. And they did not echo, and no one applauded, because no one breathed. He had not matched his mother's cruelty. He had not unmasked her or shamed her with the brother's death she carried in her own conscience. He had simply named what was true, once, in the place where the lie had been loudest, and the truth, once named by the one man entitled to name it, and backed now by the dead father's own hand, was heavier than all the silk on the front bench. The surrogate found, after a silence, that, on the evidence before him, the marriage could not be declared null, that the petition failed, and that the union solemnized in the Chapel of Ease must stand as a true marriage in the eyes of the Church. The dowager did not cry out. That was not her instrument. And she sat down slowly, and for the first time in her long life, the smooth voice had nothing smooth to say, and she looked at her son and at the girl beside him, and something in her certain face came apart very quietly, not into grief and not into rage, but into a kind of recognition she had spent 60 years arranging her life to avoid. The recognition that she had done this exact thing once before, to another son, and had buried the result in a northern rain. She had not been defeated by luck or by accident. She had been answered point for point, by a dying man's careful pen, a poor curate's free conscience, and a worth she had refused to measure because her categories had no column for it. Lucinda did not gloat. She had been raised better. And besides, she had no taste for it. When it was over and the benches were emptying and the county was deciding with the swiftness of crowds that, of course, it had always known the marriage was sound, she crossed the cold chapter house not to her husband first, but to Mr. Twett. Brockholt and she took both his green-sleeved hands in her ink-stained ones and thanked him in a voice that shook at last. Now that it was safe to shake, and he turned red to the ears and said only that her father had done the real work years ago and had never known what it would one day save. And that, she thought, was the truest thing said in the whole proceeding. There remained the dowager. And her ending was not destruction, but correction. And so it was. She left the chapter house without a word and was gone from Ravelston within the day, back to the south, to the dower house and the rooms that were hers, and, for a long season, she did not write. The Duke did not pursue her with reproaches. He had learned the cost of his family's silences, and he would not answer one with another, and so in the spring he wrote to her, plainly, that the door of Ravelston was open to her whenever she chose to walk through it as a guest of his wife, and that the choice was hers and would remain hers, and that he hoped, before another grave was dug, that she would make it differently than she had made it once before. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was the offer of a door, held open by the very man she had taught, by closing one, what a closed door costs. She came at Christmas. She came stiffly in grey silk, expecting to be made to feel her defeat, and instead the new Duchess met her in the hall, and gave her the warm room facing the park, and asked, with no edge in it at all, whether she still took her chocolate without sugar, because Lucinda had remembered. The dowager stood in the hall of the house she had ruled for 40 years, and found she did not know what to do with kindness offered by a person she had tried to erase. She managed, after a moment, to say that she did. It was not an apology. That evening, after dinner, she asked, very low, whether the chapel organ was the one that had been mended, and whether she might hear it, and Lucinda played for her in the cold chapel by candlelight the slow air her father had loved, and the dowager sat in the dark in her grey silk and did not speak when it ended, and put her gloved hand briefly to her mouth, and that was as near to an apology as a woman so constructed could come, and it was accepted as one. Miss Vosbury married an agreeable baronet the following season, and was by every account content, the two staring estates left to go on staring across their river without the help of her £40,000. Mrs. Strum. Pemberton told everyone in Lindo that she had always said the copyist was a true lady at heart, and no one corrected her, because correcting Mrs. Pemberton was more trouble than it was worth, and the High Street had other things to discuss. Mr. Pond. Brockholt was presented that same year to a small living within the Duke's gift, a snug parsonage with a garden and a fixed income, not as payment, for the Duke was careful to say it was not payment, and Brockholt was careful to believe him, but because a man who walks to a cathedral town on his own feet to save two strangers ought not to spend his life in a coat gone green at the seams, and the Duke had decided that order, real order, looked like that. They were married a second time in the spring, openly, by bands read 3 Sundays in the Ravelston chapel for the whole county to hear, not because the first marriage had needed mending, but because the first had been stolen from them in the dark, and they wanted one in the light. Lucinda wore a gown of soft cream this time, made for her, but she carried in her hand the same square of folded music she had carried into Lindell, with her 2 trunks, her father's heir in her father's hand. And after the words were said, and the register signed, she went up alone into the loft above the chapel where the whole story had begun, and laid her hand for a moment on the cool pipes she had voiced 2 springs before the instrument had brought her here. It seemed right to thank it. That evening the house was full, and warm fires in every room, and snow beginning at the long windows, the same windows the rain had run down, the day a man stepped out of a shadow and said he had not heard the chapel sound so in 7 years. The Duke found her at the end of it standing by one of those windows watching the snow, and he came and stood beside her, not touching, in the old disciplined way. And then he did touch, his hand over hers on the cold sill, ungloved the way it had been at 4 in the morning in the cold little nave, and steady now, where it had not been then. She did not say anything large. Neither did he. She told him only that the air her father loved was meant to be taken slowly enough to hurt, and that she thought perhaps this winter it might be taken a little less slowly than that. He looked at her in the firelight, and the carved stone of his face did something it had not done in 7 years, and nearly forgot how, which was to ease all the way into something almost like the amusement of a man who has stopped waiting for the door to close, and he said, low, that he would hear it taken however she chose to take it, for the rest of their lives, and that she might take her time deciding. Outside the snow came down on Ravelston and on the dower house in the south and on the green new parsonage, and on the small chapel of ease where an owl had once crossed a churchyard at the moment a copyist became a duchess, and inside, by the fire, in the house that had decided she did not belong in it. The vicar's daughter with the mended cuff stood with her husband's ungloved hand over hers, and was at last and entirely at home. If Lucinda's quiet courage stayed with you, sit a moment with it before you go, and carry it gently into your own evening. There are doors that close, and there are hands that hold them open, and the difference between them is the whole of what we are.